It's my pleasure to welcome you back to the conference this afternoon, and to especially welcome Professor Richard Hammermesh from the Harvard Business School, who's going to lead us through a case study. I just want to say that Richard has been with this conference from the beginning, and the Personalized Medicine Coalition deeply appreciates his contributions to the advisory committee and also his willingness to lead this case study on our behalf. So you're in for a treat.
Okay. Can I be heard? Can you all hear me? Good. It's good to be here and do the case study. It's always a challenge. We never know how many people have actually read the case. But I have an MBA at Harvard Business School, and when I went through the program, we would always do our own internal assessment of the quality of people's comments, okay? But the professor thought, who cared? We wanted to know what we all thought, and the criteria was that you couldn't get an A. You could get, at best, an A- if you made a marvelous presentation and had read the case. If you had made a marvelous presentation and hadn't read the case, that would get you an A. So we can, so that shouldn't be the welcome mat for any BS, but I just wanted you to know that we'll be talking. Okay, so a few things. First, with the case on the Dementia Discovery Fund, Kate Bingham, the protagonist of the case, is here. So I think we should welcome and thank Kate. We will leave the last 15 minutes for Kate to comment on the case and answer any questions you may have. So that's a bonus. And then, just as it turns out from circumstance, that Paul Stoffels, who is in the last panel, the case mentions that the Dementia Discovery Fund got off the ground with, I think, 7 pharmas invested, as well as the British government. The first pharma to sign up was Johnson & Johnson. So he played a real role in this as well. So let me just real quickly, if I can make this work, just give a real quick update on the Craft Accelerator at Harvard Business School. And you may remember, if you're a regular attendee here, that 4 years ago we announced this $20 million endowment gift from the Kraft family to advance progress in precision medicine. And at the time, this was exactly 4 years ago, Ed would remember, and others who were here, Robert Kraft was on the stage, Todd Golub, who runs the cancer program at the Broad Institute, and myself, and we talked about the gift. The gift was motivated because Robert had lost his wife, Myra, to ovarian cancer, a really tough cancer. They had been introduced to some targeted therapies late in her treatment with some help from the Broad and Eric Lander. It was a real mess how to get off-label use for these targeted therapies. And what the predicted happened. She got some response, too little, too late, and she succumbed. But the family realized that there were opportunities to advance progress in precision medicine, and thus the gift to the business school and Kathy Justy's and my efforts to lead it. And what we have done over the 4 years is, look, we're not science people. Harvard Business School does not have a wet lab. It shouldn't have a wet lab. It won't have a wet lab. But the analogy I make is that we've now moved into town, but for years we lived in an 1848 Victorian house with 3 stories in Newton, Mass, okay? If we had a blockage in the shower, no pressure on the 3rd floor, it was never because there was a problem with the 3rd floor pipes. It was the line from the street, in the basement, something along the way. And the analogy I'm trying to make is that if we want a more rapid and more efficacious flow of new molecules to cure tough diseases, we've got to knock out those blockages long before the final part of the pipeline. And so we have identified 4 areas that we've been working in. They're up here: direct to patient, and that's particularly important. We talked about this yesterday. Patients own their data. Patients can be the key to large data sets and registries being actualized. Data and analytics almost goes without saying. Innovative trials, I was really happy to hear come up in the last session. We are big proponents of these basket and umbrella trials. The notion of having to have a control arm for every drug when you could have one control arm and test 6 different drugs, it just doesn't make sense. And I often, when I talk about innovative trials, I put up a slide, and the randomized controlled trial dates back to the 1940s. I can't think of anything else from the 1940s technologically that stayed the same. But the trials are the same. Maybe someone else can. They didn't even have TVs then. And then finally, what we are also concerned with is investment. How do you get enough money into the field of precision medicine to keep the pace of advances going? And on that one, it gets us directly to this dementia discovery case. And let me just sort of give what was our interest in this. Interest 1, precision medicine beyond cancer. And this is something that's really shifted in the 4 years Kathy and I have been working on this craft, Accelerator, the application of precision medicine beyond the field of cancer. Second reason why we wanted to do it is it illustrates new financing models. And financing models and money, I'm not going to say are as important, but they're certainly a necessary condition to make the science happen. And if you go back 20 years, the only investment would come from either the philanthropic side, gifts to Dana-Farber, some disease foundations, and the venture capital community. And the venture capital community has always played a big role, except the venture capital community, we should note, has a particular problem, or maybe problem isn't the right word, constraint, which is they are unlikely in any given fund to make more than one investment in a particular disease area, because in their Monday morning partner meetings, they talk about something called concentration risks. And who would bet on more than one glioblastoma drug once every 5th fund? But we know it's going to take more activity in that field. So we've been really following closely innovations in investment. So with that as background, that leads us to the case that you all read, correct? Let me hear that again. You all read? Okay, I heard that, and you're now on the line. So what does the case say? It says that the British government was concerned about dementia. All governments should, all people should be concerned about it. I am. My mother-in-law dealt with 7, 8 horrible years with Alzheimer's, and the toll is just devastating. And they wanted to figure out how to make a dent in this disease. And of course, in a single-payer system, all the costs are going to come back to the government. In our system, it gets more fragmented in how this is all paid for. And along the way, they decide that the way to do this is through a for-profit venture capital fund called the Dementia Discovery Fund. And they say they're going to try to raise $200 million, excuse me, and they end up raising $350 million. So we start with something successful. And my opening question is going to be, since you all said this, is how are they able to do that? To be oversubscribed by 75%. Just to continue the recapitulation, The case then really raises three issues, okay, interrelated. One issue is their ability to attract experienced venture capitalists to work at the fund. Because, well, we'll talk about it. An experienced venture capitalist can work at any life sciences fund. Why would you pick Dementia, sort of a graveyard? J&J spent a lot of money. A lot of companies have spent a lot of money and haven't made much money in this field. The second issue that we have are two investments that are being proposed, and they're the first investments that have been surfaced in 6 months since Angus Grant, Dr. Angus Grant, formerly of Celgene, has come to run the fund. He's been building the team, and they want this combination of neuroscience expertise and venture expertise. And these are their first two investment proposals. So he's got some stake in this. And they're both novel hypotheses. I think we should note the whole purpose is to invest in novel hypotheses. And the theory being, not much has happened with the amyloid beta hypothesis, number one. And number two, enough money's already poured into it from J&J and others. Maybe, we can get some money poured in someplace else. So one of these companies, MetaRed, is exploring what I'll call a fibrin hypothesis. And another, Astronautics, is exploring what I'll call an astrocyte hypothesis. Very early stage companies, but different mechanisms of action. And then the third issue, of course, is it doesn't take that long for a venture capital fund to run through $350 million. And so is there going to be a fund two? And what would be the size and who would come to it? So that's the end of the Cliff Note presentation. I now raise the question for you, how is it, in your view, that they were able to raise so much more money than they thought they would? Please, and someone with the mic, and speak right up. And I think people who've been here before know how we do the drill. This is regular case discussion. I'll ask obnoxious follow-up questions, and we'll have a good time. Go ahead.
Well, one, I think it's an emotional issue because Alzheimer's does affect so many people. Two, we've got a tidal wave of aging coming upon us. And three, if you're the first and if you find something effective, you're going to make a lot of money.
Okay, so you're saying that one of the reasons is because people are scared.
Yes.
And so you're scared, and therefore I'll put down $30 million for this cause.
Well, it's not so much.
Keep the mic, keep the mic.
Okay. All right. We know that there are certain genetic predispositions to Alzheimer's disease, and if it runs in your family, and if you think that there's a chance that you or your spouse are going to get it, so there's the caregiver aspect of it. There's also everything that goes along with it, the cost to our government, the cost to our healthcare system. And we in America, I can't speak to Britain, but we're an aging demographic if we don't allow in
They're getting older too, yeah. All right. So, no, but when I hear you, you're very clear. You're saying, look, it's somewhat self-interest. It's an emotional issue. I mentioned my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's. It doesn't run in my family. My father had perfect cognition until he was 99 years old. So, but you're saying my wife may be throwing the elbow to me to put some money in this fund, an extra $30 million that we happen to have laying around.
I don't think your wife would be throwing the elbow to you.
Okay.
I think you should be throwing the elbow because if she gets it, you're going to have to take care of her.
Whoa! Whoa! I think that's called guilt tripping me.
No, that's called watching out for one's own self-interest.
Okay, very good. I'll have to figure out how to bring that up at the dinner table tonight. But then your third point, though, I thought is very salient also. You said there's money to be made here.
There's loads of money to be made if you can crack the code.
We know the numbers, and those are in the case. We don't have to review. And let's say you make 10, 15 investments. How many would you need of the code cracking variety do you think that could cover the whole fund? One. Okay, we can debate that, but this is one of the theories, and I think there's a fellow named Andrew Lowe at MIT who's written on this and done simulations, with the probabilities, and you're not that far off. So I thank you very much. Other comments on why they were able to raise so much money so fluidly? There's one here and back here as well. Let's get it to Michael and have someone with the mic for the second person.
Yeah, so I would add to what's been said a couple of things. One, if you look at the investors, it was heavily strategic investors, pharma companies, and others, mission-driven, Alzheimer's Foundation, ARP, et cetera. And by the way, for those mission-driven organizations,
Right next to the mic.
For the mission-driven organizations, there was a recent example where the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation made several billion by choosing a similar strategy, sprinkling a relatively small amount of money around. But the other thing for the pharma companies, the amounts of money they're putting into this are fairly small relative to the billion-dollar-plus cost of developing a drug. So I think those investments are effectively call options on a large payoff.
Boy, it's such an interesting comment, Michael, because you're saying, look at the pharma, and we gave Paul a big shout out, and now you say, hold it, $10 million? Didn't they tell us at the last panel that he has a budget of $10 billion to spend on R&D? Yep. This is like, he probably didn't even have to get approval to do this.
Exactly. For a pharma company, these are small amounts by pharma company investments.
By pharma company standards. And what I'm hearing you say is, and in an area that they've sort of struck out in, so why not have your finger in this pot? So that explains them. That's their motivation. And the Bill Gates motivation, let's keep Bill Gates aside. The AARP or the National Football Players Association stake in this is?
I think two things. I think there is a mission-driven component. They do have a certain amount of funds that they do want to invest in areas to help their members. So I think that makes sense. I believe the altruism there. And the other thing, again, there are a couple of examples, and I mentioned the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, where you have not-for-profits that have invested in early-stage research with a similar strategy and have struck it really big.
CF is the poster child.
Yes.
For this. Although interesting, just to note, the CF investments were pure venture philanthropy. The money that was raised that they gave money to Vertex was for licensing revenues. No one knows exactly, but someone knows what exactly the terms, what the terms were. But that money all went back to the CF pot. It didn't, in other words, the people who wrote the checks for that took the tax write-off in that year.
Yeah.
That's different than DDF. This is a for-profit fund.
Yes.
But your point stands nonetheless. There's a whole lot of money because we know that CF monetized their royalty stream for $3.3 billion. So there's some math to work out there. And that goes to the prior point of one hit in an area like this, and you'll cover all the losses, at the craps table that was going on. Someone over here had a comment, please.
I think people are sick of sickness and sick of disability, especially with something like dementia, which we all know is an epidemiological disaster, and so is mental illness, so is ADHD, and so on, and we know they're all related because we follow the research to us commoners. So ask the commoners for money.
Well, it's interesting about asking commoners for money because that so far has, at least with this fund, and I think this was not alluded to, it's stated, these have been big investors who've put the money in here, 30, 40, $50 million at a pop. Any other points anyone wants to make about why they've been able to raise money? Did you want to add something more? I'm sorry.
Well, with apologies to Bernie, we're going to give you $2.70 for a lot of us. And you're going to take the pharma investor and the sympathy investor to develop a marketing campaign to get millions and millions and millions of $2.70. We're going to divert advertising from politics to solving this crisis, and we're going to have ice bucket things and all that stuff.
We got someone, a real enthusiast. And I'm not just... Any other reasons why you think they were able to raise the funds, raise that much money? And additional points right behind you, please. Children. So we're all playing like this sympathy card here. Let me just posit one other, which is, well, I could ask her two questions. I'll give one question and one answer. One question is, why did they do this as a for-profit fund? Why didn't they just do this as venture philanthropy? And then have the money all go back to different charitable organizations? I think that's a question really worth pondering in this group. Why? And mind you, CF, the poster child for this, was pure venture philanthropy. Okay? So they're taking a for-profit model. And they're going for large investors. So if they get the one hit, it's Bill Gates who will make money. It's AARP who will make money. This isn't, a small mutual fund that Fidelity or Vanguard are running. So one question I want to really push people on is, why would you do it as a for-profit fund? And the other I'll give an answer to, what we haven't spoken to. I think one reason why they attracted money happened to be the fund manager who they picked. That if you, in venture capital, if no one's told you this before, then you're hearing it for the first time, and I want to be cited at your dinner table. If you're not investing in the top tier funds, don't waste your time and money. That the difference in performance of the top performing funds is so great. And what the British government was able to do when they put out their tender for this, and excuse me, but you can't teach a case with your coat on, they were able to attract SV Health and Kate Bingham in particular, who has a track record of doing this over 20 number of years. 20. Yes, we won't deal with precise numbers. So that was sort of another piece of the puzzle. Who's the fund manager? And you don't think the investors didn't, the $100 million came in early on. I think it said October 2015. The fund wasn't closed until, I think I'm going to say May of 18. I think I have that right. So more monies came in. You don't think that as more monies came in, they didn't interview the team and make some assessments of it. But let me just go back to the prior question, because I've given you now enough time to think about it. Why a for-profit fund? Why not just do this? Michael, you've already spoken. Anyone else? Oh, next to Mike. Do you have a surrogate, Mike? Someone, please. Why would you please? We'll get you, Mike. You can't hang on the sides here.
Yeah. So it's convenient to the bathroom.
Stay up here. Stay close. I want to see you.
I don't want to get too close here.
Oh, I'm not contagious.
No, it's pure greed in a weird way. It's a relative size of the markets. I mean, you think about what the cystic fibrosis market could potentially be versus Alzheimer's market.
Okay.
That's a very attractive thing.
I hear the comment. He says, why is it a for-profit fund? Out of greed. No one's made any money in dementia so far, but suddenly millions are going to be minted. I hear that point. Other points, other reasons why you would do this, please.
It opens up a bigger pool of potential money. There's only so much philanthropy money out there.
So you're saying that if it's just philanthropy, there's a limited amount. The lure of the buck is going to make more money available. Reasonable point of view. Others? How about, please?
I think, first of all, the failure cycle that has come before is a benefit. So these companies don't have to go through
There
quite
have
as
been
many
so
failures.
many failures. It's sort of like a basketball player misses 20 shots in a row. They
next
got to make one
ones,
eventually.
Exactly, flip it again. But the prevention strategy. So what a lot of these failures have taught us
Okay.
is you need to move earlier for prevention.
Okay, so we've
And the
learned
market
something, their
just
probability of
enlarges.
success. Any other reasons? I'm going to give you another shot or two, and then I'll give my little spiel here. Please.
Maybe the for-profits have like a hanky-pank with the taxing and make it work for
Okay,
themselves.
so I hear you.
Hi. So I view it as venture capitalists don't just look at one thing, they look beyond. And so although this is about dementia, is it really just about dementia, or, stealing your term, cracking the code to the brain and getting more information on
okay.
then how to further invest in other areas?
Look, if this astrocyte works thing, maybe it will work also with multiple sclerosis
Exactly.
or whatever. You know,
Exactly, self-indulge.
and I don't understand the science much of either of the two proposals here. It's beyond, but I do understand that there are applications of these beyond dementia. I'm going to give one more, and then I'm going to give a
I have the
real
mic.
business school response to this question. This gentleman had his hand up here, and his shoulder's starting to hurt.
I was just going to say it was the political climate in the UK when this was thought about. Like, the government was all about business and for-profit, so it
This is a
fitted-
vestige of a conservative government.
Yeah, it fitted in with the government at the time.
Okay, good, interesting. Last person, then I'll just add one little comment on this.
I mean, one factor might be that the people who are investing think that if they come up with something, they'll have a lot of buy-in from the British government and the NHS, which is a big base.
Well, by the way, I think this is a very valid point that didn't come up earlier, that comes up a lot. How are they able to raise so much money? They have the blessing of the British government. Now, they don't have the guarantee of the British government. They're not going to insure the losses, but you're saying there is some credibility. And let me just add one other, and I think there's truth in all the comments that people have made. There are some of us who think that the private markets are more efficient than the not-for-profit markets. That I personally want to know that they have market discipline. And I'm tired of giving money to nonprofits who end up frittering it away. And now again, I've been hyperbolic for effect, which is my job, but I think the general point, if you get rid of the exaggeration, is that I'd rather have the money, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions, with SV Health and Kate Bingham's team picking 10, 12 investments than me giving another donation to the Alzheimer's Association. And they're not necessarily either ors, here, so I don't want to exaggerate the point, but some people feel that the discipline of the private markets, because they can't strike out over and over again. And just to note, their first investment was very interesting and very clever. This is a case fact. They invested in a company called Elector that was much closer to market, and they were able to IPO, and nothing helps the reputation of a venture capital fund more than an early step up in value. They didn't go public, they just did another round. They went public. So, and at that point, I assume the shares are distributed to the investors, they get their, I'm not quite sure exactly how it worked. So it's not waterfall, it's the British system.
No, the company's gone public, we still hold the shares.
Oh, you hold the shares.
And it is a key topic at the investment committee as of what point we should start selling the shares because there's a pipeline.
And when you do sell the shares, is there a return to? Then it's a return, as in all VC funds. You don't wait till the end. If there's a return on one of the investments, at the time it's liquidated, in your case, sell the shares, you distribute the money out. Oh, and SV keeps it 20% of the carry, and the whole bit. Okay, then we're into more details. So you get the picture. I think this has been a good discussion, as to how they raise the money, why they would do it this way, and for my purposes with the case, this is one of the core issues to think about. Do you want, these for-profit funds? UBS and MPM, a local venture capital firm, raised $476 million to something called an Oncology Impact Fund. And that's only in oncology, for-profit, similar type of deal. So let's go to the case issues, okay? And I'm hoping everyone got far enough in these. One of them is how to attract the right team. And as I said before, in venture capital, probably in everything, you're betting on that team. Who are the partners who can create new companies from scratch and do it repeatedly, not one-hit wonders, and there are firms and venture capitalists who do this, and what it says in the case is that they need to build out the team more. Angus Grant now is tasked with this as the CEO. He brings in some neurology folks, good, but now you want some A investors to join the fund who have track records. Now, I asked a poll question on this, and I know you all filled out the poll because I saw the results. Did you do the poll? You're probably the only one in the room who didn't. Did you do it? Did you do it? No, Jesus. 0 for 2. I mean, I can't believe it. But let me just share this. We asked the poll question, will they be able to raise? Will they be able to hire 2 experienced VCs to join the fund, to give that tough, hard-nosed VC take on this, and by the way, also have company building skills. And 100% of you said they'll be able to. Okay? So who said they'd be able to? Raise your hand. Anyone else? Okay. Are you willing to talk? I mean, please. I'm a very experienced and skilled venture capitalist. I've made a bunch of money in cancer. I've made a bunch of money in analytic companies. And somehow through a headhunter, and just out of curiosity, you, Angus King, are going to convince me that I should leave my successful venture capital fund to join the Dementia Discovery Fund. In parenthesis, it has a 15-year life, this fund. So just as a starting position, I need to explain to my wife, very demanding person, who said that for at least 5 years, there's not going to be any return on this thing because it's so early stage. Stand up.
This is very high pressure.
Okay, go for it.
I don't have a very overly intelligent response. I would say either you have somebody that's affected by Alzheimer's, and you may be in a position where you feel like you don't need to be producing the same amount of income as you were before.
Okay, it's a very interesting comment. You're saying that you're going to give up on the purely rational.
Yeah.
That the odds and the simulations and Andrew Lowe, and you just have to hit 1 out of 10, and you'll be famous in the cover of Time magazine.
Yeah.
You're going to play for your mom had dementia.
We're all still human. Well, most people.
Yeah. You're going to do it for emotional, and of course, and you also put a footnote in, hey, and haven't you already made a lot of money that Elizabeth Warren's just going to tax anyway?
Yeah.
So you may as well just do something worthwhile with your life.
Does that work? Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
How do people react to that? People, thank you very much. I appreciate it. That takes a little bit of, chutzpah is what we call it, where I'm from, to get up and play a role play versus me. Please.
That's how Michael Cameron pounding his fist on the table.
David Cameron, yeah.
Because he had a child with a rare disease, got Genomics England going, and England to solve democratically genomics.
Gotcha. Okay, so that we just dealt with that issue. How do you attract someone? What I'm hearing is the standing hypothesis is that yes, it's a rational appeal, but there's also sort of an emotional element about dementia, and and beyond just its pervasiveness in the societal way, a personal pervasiveness. We could ask the room, and I won't, but if you ask people, how many of you have someone in your family that was affected by cancer? 3/4, whatever, huge number. How many of you, I'll do this one. Okay, let's do the first one. How many of you have a relative or close friend in your family who's been affected by cancer? Raise your hands. See, okay. How many have had a relative or a close friend affected by some form of dementia? Okay, so there you have it. And I didn't raise my hand because I was looking, but I would have raised my hand yes on both of those as well. So let's now take the second question. Which of these two companies would you invest in? And it's kind of tough. It's late in the case that this comes up, so I don't know if everyone read that far. But when we were doing the case, one of the things I said to Kate and Angus is, we need good arguments for and against each one, because it's easier for me to teach a case if it's divided 50-50 in the room. That way I just ask people what they think, I let them debate, I sit on the chair, and people talk. And by the way, that's how it turned out here. Just a complete 50-50 split between the two. Does anyone feel prepared enough to talk about the two investments, why they would prefer one rather than the other, please? And maybe give a little summary of your description of the two and why you favor one over the other.
Sure. My name is Bruce Quinn. The first part of my career was in Alzheimer's disease research until about 15 years ago. And one of the investments is a very early stage company that thinks it can affect fibrin deposition in the brain, and that might affect the inflammatory pathway. My own research actually was in astrocytes, and the other company, as you mentioned, is called Astronaut, and would try to interfere with astrocytes and the way they're affected in Alzheimer's disease. My comment, having had that science background and reading these, is they're both extremely early, extremely high risk. They're both 1 in 1,000 shots. And so you argued, is it a 1 in 1,000 shot or a 1 in 1,100 shot? It's hard to tell. They're both very distant, high-risk projects.
And hold it, don't
Sure.
give up the mic quite so fast. If it's 1 in 1,000, that does not help us with our opening comment here, because I think you were saying 1 in 10 is going to cover the fund, maybe 1 in 50. If it's 1 in 1,000, I mean, then probably neither of them are very good investments.
Well,
and
I can't
you've got to make 1,000 investments.
And I can't predict if it's 1 in 70 or 1 in 1,000. It's some teeny number. The other thing I thought is...
So, but let me just push. Does that mean that you're in favor of neither or both? Or
Probably both, because you'd push both further and try to get more information about them.
So you would say both very early stage. This is company formation stuff here. And one of them, the IP isn't even all tied up neatly. They have to bring in a team. This is what the really good VCs do. They just don't read business plans and put a thumb up or down. They build the team around novel science. And you're saying you would make both. And I have to say that in the poll question, you were asked one or the other. So you get a failing grade in the poll, but a very clever answer in class. So I hear you. Anyone else want to take a stab, please? And then we'll get you, ma'am.
Alzheimer's? You.
Me? What's your question?
In other words, you said you made a lot of money on
Did I
cancer.
say that?
Yes.
I didn't know. I haven't personally. Oh, yeah, my fictional person, yes.
Oh, fictional. Oh.
Oh, yeah,
I thought you were going to have the answer here for us.
no, I assume identities at will. Thank you, though. I appreciate your overestimation of my wealth. Please, over here.
I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
So it seems like MetaRed had non-CNS indication possibilities. So to me, wouldn't that tip the scale
In favor.
in favor of that, where you could de-risk it and
MetaRed
get out of
seems
CNS?
more expansive in its platform to you. Seems that way.
Mechanism of action.
Yeah. So it seems more apparent. Others on this, we've gone here 3 times, so I want to keep passing it around, please.
The Astrotal company is
The astrocyte company.
The
please.
astrocyte company.
Astronautics, go on.
That is, I don't really know too much about the science, but that's a really novel concept. In the sense that the other one is a blood-brain barrier problem, and that could still be a real challenge for a lot of the drugs, et cetera. A lot of failures happen because of that. And the second is that one to market is really long, but that's the purpose of a 15-year fund.
So I want to hear which one then you come down in favor of. Is it?
The second one,
As astronaut. You're saying it's going to be really long, but by the way, there's a comment in the case on astronautics that is attributed to Angus. It could be attributed to Kate just as easily. His contention is that if they don't do it, this isn't going to happen, and don't kid yourself that the NIH is going to step in. Did you agree with that? With that comment? And that's the purpose of the fund, to do these, and with the hope that there are robust returns to justify it. I'm going to turn it over to Kate for comments and update and questions here. But in the end, if they just do one fund, unless it attracts lots more money to the field with novel hypotheses, they need a second fund to do this again. A $500 million fund. Now, you could argue, and maybe we'll have a future case study on this, if they attract enough excitement to the field, maybe, there won't be a need for the explicit DDF. There'll be lots of other funds doing this. So one question becomes, which of these two are likely to give your investors and potential new investors confidence to come in, because they'll be needing the funds. I think the case has 2, maybe 3 years at most. And that's before we'll know much about astronautics. So look, this was well done. Kate, why don't you stand up and comments on the discussion and any update, please. And Paul, you're welcome as well.
Yeah, I'm going to cold call on Paul, since he actually is the reason I'm standing here today. So just to address some of the quick snapshots, just so you know where we are. The fund is as we talked about, is closed at 250 sterling, which was, the original target was in sterling, 120. So it was a very substantial increase from where we expected to be. We've invested, committed, and reserved about half that fund across about 20 investments. And of those 20 investments, about half of them are what we think of as, or we call projects. So these are hypothesis testing investments where we've got a very interesting potential idea, but we're not yet ready to write a large check into it. So if they work, then we will spin them out into companies and we'll recruit full management teams and bring in more cash. But actually, until that time, we want to just build up a more robust data set. Because we were tactical about how we invested the fund, we do have we're sitting on a positive gross IRR at the moment, which is great. And I just want to address some of the questions you raised. So why did we raise the money? And it is a completely legitimate question because this is an area which has had 100% failure rate. And asking financial investors for a 15-year commitment where they have no ability to get their cash back at any point. This is an illiquid, fund. And so I did figure out after a bit that actually going to a pure financial investor was going to be quite challenging. So the answer that we had right at the beginning, emotional, aging population, and so on, of course that's relevant, but that wasn't the reason people got their checks out to actually invest in the fund. The reason they got it out was because they had some sort of strategic or mission drive to actually see progress made in the field. And it's unquestionable that the whole field of dementia and Alzheimer's is vastly under-resourced compared with cancer. And so by pivoting more strongly to the strategic investors, we were able to raise the money that we did, which worked very well. And I'll let Paul talk about why did the strategics come in, and specifically the pharma companies, and why Paul put his hand up at the beginning. Can I hand over? Can we get a
Let's get a
microphone
mic
for Paul? And while we're getting microphone, why was a for-profit fund?
Yes, please.
The reason it's a for-profit fund is we, the venture capitalists, invest our own money. And so we are personally on the hook for, I forget whether it's 2% of the fund we've actually invested. So we are massively motivated to make sure that the investments we make have a prospect of not only returning the cash we've invested, but making a substantial return as well. So that is why I think it actually works to do it in a for-profit fund as opposed to a philanthropic consortium or something like that. And it just forces discipline in a way that I think only, the governance and discipline that you do get with the private equity.
Okay, I want to hear from Paul, but what I'm also hearing you say is if you're going to attract top people to SV to work on this, they need to know they're going to make some money for their efforts.
And they've got to write a check to buy their carry. This is very different from recruiting into a biotech firm where you say, come and be a CSO of this company, and by the way, we'll give you, $1 million worth of options. We're saying, come and join us at SV to run this fund, and by the way, you've got to write the check into the fund. So this was a real tall order. So please. Paul, tell us about why you invested.
Reason why this was, and I'll get into the two pieces. One was part of the Dementia, the World Dementia Council. We needed to do transformational things to make more progress in Alzheimer, and that was the mission. That was the mandate from David Cameron and the G8, in fact, because everyone contributed to that in that decision. But why a venture capital? Because we are out of options, new targets in Alzheimer and dementia, and we had to force the model to go into a different way. And in order to create a pull mechanism from biotechs, from academia to get going into new targets, but also have the selection pressure, which you need from a venture capital to make sure that they make the right decisions, the venture capital solution was the best solution to get into new targets. And it was absolutely not we put in 10 million to be able to make money on that. It was to force the model into a different direction. That's what the basis was on why in the World Dementia Council said, let's do a for-profit venture capital model to do the right thing, and let's kick off with as much as we can. It was 100 million. Now, there was more than that. The goal was, can we get to new medicines in the next 10 years? And at that moment was by 2025.
Right.
And so there were many more initiatives, like working with the regulators on accelerating biomarkers and the use of biomarkers to get to endpoints in Alzheimer, setting up collaborative efforts on discovering the biomarkers, but also setting up clinical trial networks to recruit patients faster in order to get more patients into clinical trials as well into combination trials. It was a comprehensive activity in order to get dementia research pushed forward, and the discovery was, let's do it through a venture capital fund because that would work.
Thank you, and I want to continue on what happened, but something that I interpret here, and it was actually something I thought about when you were on your prior panel and being interviewed by Meg. You're at some point at J&J and its pipeline, you have your own pipeline. but you also have a pipeline from the East Cambridge community too. And in a sense, you're saying the 7 big pharmas, we need ideas from outside our own labs here. And let's give it to people who are profit motivated.
Yes, and what's interesting is so the major pharmaceutical companies that invested in the fund sit on our scientific advisory board. So regularly, we present to them to say, this is what we've done, this is what we're planning on doing, and this is the progress we're making. And so they can hold us to account. They can't make the decisions for us, but they can certainly hold our feet to the fire to say, why are you doing that? I don't believe that data. You know, this person makes it up, or whatever. So actually, it's a nice relationship for us to learn from some of the failures that have taken place in the past, that we can say, okay, that's not a path we're going to go down. We're now going to look at some of these other paths. And to the extent there are learnings from what are basically the leading pharmaceutical companies in the space, we'd like to share in those, because at this stage, we're just non-competitive with what they're doing. We're coming up with these crazy, and you're quite right, 1,000 to 1 is generous in terms of the speculative basis of some of what we're exploring. But if we're clever about how we invest it, I would hope we would be able to generate some phase 2 and phase 1b efficacy data. And just to be clear, we do not have to take the drugs to market to make a return. We're selling loss-making R&D companies, and we're selling data and patents. So that's what we need to show is a compelling data package, which a Paul can actually then take on and develop further.
You gave a shout out to the gentleman up here. What did you do about astronautics and Meta?
We invested in both. So
well done.
And actually, we've since had third-party funding coming into each company. So that, we think, is a helpful endorsement. It clearly is a tiny, tiny step on the way. And the way we address this whole issue of risk, which of course it is highly risky, is just to be very careful, and this is where the SEB is helpful, very careful to fund to try and de-risk it. So even if we commit $5 million to a particular approach, we might only put $1 million in at the beginning and agree what are the key value inflection points that are actually going to help influence putting more cash in. And that's how, and we've written 3 companies off already. So we want to write off as quickly as we can and not pour more money into it.
So the venture capital model, fail quickly.
Paul?
If you're going to fail quickly. Don't fail at phase 3. I mean, that's terribly expensive. Try out the hypotheses, tranche the investments. And Kate, you say it's one small step on the way. When I've had more time to teach the case, I'll say, well, what would be a criteria that would let someone know to invest in fund 2, 3? And one criteria that I hope will pull out of the room typically is that you'd get some co-investors, that people would be wanting to join the syndicate. MetaRed and Astronautics, you're in first. Paul, did you want to add something, please?
I just want to add that.
And then we'll take questions from the group.
We don't have, although we invest and we are on the advisory board, we don't have any rights on these products. So we don't have any call rights or any option on these products. We have one thing which we can learn first, so from what you do. But if Kate has a result, she will competitively sell this in the world for the maximum amount of money. So we will not have, and that's the principle on how this will work, but
she wants you to overpay for one of these.
Of course we do.
Absolutely. Well, we have invested at the same time.
And it's going to cost more than $10 million.
But that's the principle, just to make sure that
No, that's great. We have time. Let's take 2 or 3 questions from the group.
Hi, I'm Helen from Flatiron Health. So one of the interesting parts about this question, I thought, was that the current treatments for dementia are treating the symptoms, but not necessarily disease-modifying. And it seems like the investment model for finding a disease-modifying drug is much longer than finding something that's just treating the symptoms, because you have to do a lot more basic research. And so did you ever face any pressure from investors saying, can we just find something else that maybe is treating the symptoms better instead of waiting for the long turnaround time of R&D?
Not really, because the entire thesis of the fund was disease-modifying therapeutics. So while we may end up with the odd project that would be symptomatic. That's not the thesis of the fund. So if investors didn't want to invest in that higher bar, they weren't going to be investing. We were fundraising for a long time. So for a venture fund to start in 2015 and not finish till 18, that's a long time for a venture fund to raise. But not unreasonably, new investors wanted to see the team, they wanted to see what we were investing in, and they wanted some level of track record. I don't quite, I mean, the point about the trials are easier is possibly true. And actually one of the things, again, that is hugely helpful from the strategics is how do you actually monitor these patients in clinical studies? Because at the moment we have fairly ropey, ADAS-Cog type diagnostics, which take a long time, and they're just simply not fit for purpose for actually testing, as you would in cancer, where you're looking at biomarkers, or any other diseases, where you can get quick readouts of mechanism before you have cognitive decline, which is the way at the moment it's being tested. So Gates invested in the fund personally. He created a separate initiative to support the development of biomarkers and better ways to actually do the clinical trial evaluation. And we are working with our strategics now to try and combine biomarker imaging and behavioral. So the one area that actually everyone notices, which is the reason you go to the physician in the first place, is because of behavioral changes. And you're starting to forget things, and your mood may change. I mean, there are various things that happen, and yet that's the one aspect that is simply not picked up. So that's something that we can help. It's not a core activity of the fund, but if, as a result of all of this and bringing people together, we have better ways of doing these clinical developments, so better ways of stratifying the patients, working out who are the patients who are likely to respond to this, whatever precision medicine we've got, and then better ways to monitor them, that will be a big win. And that is something we are definitely focused on.
Let's have two more questions from the group.
We've got 1,000 to 1 at the back here, so we should have him.
Thank you, Richard, Kate, and Paul. I actually did a fund very similar to this 25 years ago for neuroprotection, much smaller scale, but we followed the same track you did. Rather than financing portfolio companies, we ended up doing project financing, and we managed the portfolio of projects virtually to avoid duplication of managerial cost and the like. So I'm curious, when you say you funded 20 projects, are these 20 distinct entities?
No, sorry. So we've made 20 investments, of which about half are projects. So
Okay.
we have incubator facilities in both London and Boston, where we have teams. So of the 15, about half of those are company creators or entrepreneurs who are overseeing those projects, and then half are venture capitalists. And we put them in our own incubators. So but half of them are companies.
All right. So those that are projects, you wait before forming a formal company or entity?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a very important distinction. The one is a project. If it bears enough fruit, then you'll think about company formation and who the CEO is, and it's been split about 50-50, which to my view is very true to the purpose of the fund, right? I mean, if they're all just projects, no one's going to get a return on this.
That's right.
So you hope that some are, and you would characterize both MetaRed and Astronautics as in project stage or company formation stage?
We did actually invest them both as companies, but very early.
But very early, okay. Please.
Yes, I was wondering if you could describe how academic institutions or researchers from which you've licensed some of their research for these companies will potentially benefit financially. And also, could you share with us the fund's reaction to the recent Biogen Alzheimer's news?
Okay. Did everyone hear that? Because
very good question.
The first question was, how do the academic contributors who've actually contributed to the scientific insights benefit from any investment? It's very straightforward. They end up, as founders of the company, they end up with equity. We will typically be running SRAs, so strategic research agreements, in their labs. So their labs will benefit from whatever work we fund in their labs. And their institution, we will have an agreement to license the know-how. Very rarely is there any patents at this point. but the know-how is valuable, so that we will then license that from their institution, which would be typically milestones and royalties, so it'd be standard. And Biogen, I just hope on the aducanumab, I don't know who's been following it, but when they first announced, I mean, it's very instructive for why I think, and there was one lady that said we needed one investment to make this successful. When aducanumab, their phase 1b data was first announced, it was a dose response trial, and I forget, there were 3 or 4 dose arms and a placebo, and each arm was only about 25 or 30 patients. And when they released that initial positive data on what is a pretty small phase 1b study, their market cap went up $10 billion. Now, when they went into phase 3, and they invested very substantially into 2 pivotal studies, this year recently they announced that, or earlier this year they announced that those trials had failed futility, and so then their stock went down again billions. And then very recently they've gone back to say, actually, on looking at the data, they think I hope, pull out a signal. Now, I say I hope because I think it'll be hugely helpful to the field to have a success. And even though it's unlikely to apply very broadly across all dementia patients or all Alzheimer patients, I hope there is a group of patients they've been able to find that do benefit from this drug. Because as soon as we have one, even if it's a small one, a disease-modifying drug, it will give investors and entrepreneurs confidence to actually come back into the field.
A really good example of how the ecosystem can feed on itself, and that one success will beget another. I want to thank Paul for going in early on this. You were the first pharma. For Kate to commit her firm to this. And I have to say, I think this is my 10th or 11th case study I've done here. I've written all of them, so they're all my children. But having said this, I think this is the most important case we've ever done here in terms of what one could do to try to combine both the elements of modern finance, entrepreneurial finance, to try to tackle a really tough science problem. And I commend you for being part of it and helping us do the case. Thank you.
We'd like to thank you for that.
Brilliant.
So our last panel is going to look at something called shared value. And like the case study that we just completed, it's an effort to solve problems and move the field of personalized medicine forward. I'd like to call on Bill Dalton, PMC board member, to introduce the panel.
Slide clicker over there.
It's right there on the table.
Okay. Well, thank you for those that are here. If you were at Mike Bellini's panel discussion, I'm the last moderator he was referring to. But you're going to like this. You heard the case study. This is a group that's going to tell you the solution. I think clearly we've heard throughout this entire meeting the need for multiple partners to come together to create resources that will benefit all stakeholders. And this will require not only data sharing, but the ability to collaborate, use that data. And frankly, we've got a ways to go in that area. And I'm here to tell you that no one stakeholder, industry, research, academia, can do it by itself. So what you're going to hear from this group is the idea of the ecosystem of shared value through collective impact. The collective impact is the coalition of the willing, of partners that want to see this happen. And the ecosystem of shared value is creating a resource that all stakeholders benefit from. Now, what I'm excited about is we've got some very recognizable thought leaders that are going to represent various stakeholders. We've got Bonnie Auderio from the GO Foundation in Lung Cancer.
GO2.
GO2.
The O2 is for oxygen, by the way.
Oh, very good. See, I learned something already.
Yeah.
And Sarah Emmond who's the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. So she'll be discussing the policies, the regulations, amongst other things. And we have Anne-Marie Martin, who will represent our researchers. And this is, she has experience in both academia and pharma, so she can give the wide spectrum. And then finally, Michael Sherman is going to tell us how we're going to pay for it and not bankrupt the system in doing so. So I'm thrilled that they're here. So we've been talking about this for some years. This is the 15th anniversary of the PMC meeting. So it started in 2004. This is just a paper that came out in 2006 from Science. It was totally dedicated to precision/personalized medicine. 13 years later, we're still talking about how we're going to do it. But I think we're getting some ideas. So this panel is going to tell you how we're going to get there from here. And forget about it is not an option. It's just there. All right. I feel like I'm carrying coals to Newcastle because this is going to be a bit different than what we've had in other panel discussions throughout this meeting. This particular group decided to take on a business model as a possibility for creating the foundation of a new resource, i.e. system, that will not only aggregate data, but build it in such a way that that data can be shared by multiple stakeholders, ultimately producing evidence of value, including, obviously, value to the patient. That's our number one of our stakeholders. And I'm going to ask Bonnie Adario to begin our perspective from different stakeholders. But I think we all, and I know we do, agree that it's the ultimate patient that will tell us what we need to do. If we make assumptions as other stakeholders, we're in trouble. And frankly, most of the patient advocates that I know, I've never had to ask, well, what do you think? So, Bonnie?
That is so true. I just thank you again to Mike Polini for putting us last, and Ed. But the good news is, next time we'll be, in the first group on day one. My name is Bonnie Adario, and I started 2 foundations for lung cancer, mostly around the injustice. I'm a lung cancer survivor. Over a decade ago, I was diagnosed with stage 3B lung cancer, and my cancer was on my heart. I was told by more than one person there was nothing they could do for me, that I was not surgical. They were going to give me a little chemo because at the time, it was actually 2003. And Tarceva, or erlotinib, had just come out of clinical trials. So that was really the only targeted drug at the time. And the only options were chemo. A little chemo, then you're going to die, and we'll move on. And I just could not take that answer. So I found a renegade physician, surgeon at UCSF, and he said, Bonnie, what do you want from me? And I said, if I'm going to die from this disease, I don't want it to be because I did nothing. So I convinced him to give me a shot at it. So he said, okay, he put together a team and said, we're going to ply you with chemotherapy every day of the week, radiation, and if we can pull that away from your heart enough, then we'll go in and try surgery. Good news, 15 years later, I'm here because he stepped out of a box. He did some things that were clearly not standard of care for lung cancer at the time. And that was the beginning of me jumping in his bandwagon. I made a promise to myself when I first had chemotherapy that if I got through the knothole, I would do something about this. Lung cancer is 30% of all cancer. So I think I'm pretty qualified to be on this panel to talk about, patient advocacy and what can be done. I'm going to give you two percentages that will tell us, it'll be a real good start for us. 80% of all cancer patients are treated in community hospitals and community practice. That that is a big statement. That's a lot of patients. They're not getting academic care in the communities. And I don't mean to be negative about the oncologists that work in the communities. These poor people are trying to treat hundreds of cancers, and it's impossible to keep up with that. But that's one place where we can do a lot of work and save a lot of patients in a lot of ways. The other one is something that really relates to all cancer as well, and it actually relates to all disease, and it's called clinical trials. 50% of all the clinical trials in the United States happen in 10 states. So if you just do a little simple math, you'll understand that we need to bring clinical trials to the patients where they live and where they're sick. We cannot expect them to continue to travel away from their homes and their jobs. And oh, by the way, just because you're diagnosed with cancer doesn't mean you get to quit work. Most cancer patients are still working. And you know the names. I bet you're all starting in some MD Anderson, Memorial Sloan Kettering. You know where these are. So those are just a couple of things that if you start thinking, there's two ways to make money: profit and spending. And saving money is equally as important as making money. And just these two percentages I gave you just a minute ago show us we can do a ton of work really early on in this group to change how things are happening in all cancer and all diseases for the most part.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. You can see why I asked her to speak first. And I think she also framed a very important point that we need to discuss as we build the system. That's inclusivity and accessibility for the patient to therapy. If we build it and expect them to come, it's not going to work. That's what I believe I heard from you.
Exactly.
What I would like to do before I ask Michael to speak to the payer and provider perspective is, again, give some credit to the people that developed this business plan, if you will, this ecosystem of shared value through collective impact. It was written, the paper that described this business approach was written in the Harvard Business Review in October 2016 issue. And when you read it, and I hope you do, there's the address to go find it. You'll see that when they speak to this idea of collective impact with multiple stakeholders coming together to build a resource that no one stakeholder can build, which actually creates revenue for each stakeholder, but also addresses societal need. Very ambitious, but it's happening. And they gave examples, for example, the HIV detection and diagnosis and treatment in South Africa was done in a way of sharing value, sharing goals with collective impact of individual companies, et cetera, that brought certain skill sets to build this resource that no one stakeholder could do. But they came up with 5 key elements to make this work. The first was the stakeholders need to acknowledge the problem, share the same idea of what the problem being addressed is. That's number 1. And number 2, create metrics of success. So how do you define success as you build this system to address the problem? I remember just yesterday, I don't know if Richard's still here. Thank you. He stood up and said, if you're not measuring it, it ain't happening.
That's right.
And he's right. So as we build this system, it's going to be very important as we define success that we have metrics that measure that success, such as accessibility of patients to trials.
Right now it's 4%. We can do a lot of work there.
Exactly. The other is each stakeholder recognizing the incentive. By the way, the elements are in the paper. The ideas of what need to be addressed with these elements comes from this panel. Again, they spent considerable time putting this together. But recognizing diverse incentives. Yes, you have your own incentive and reason to want this resource to be built, but recognize the need and shared value of what the other stakeholders need. Constant communication. I will tell you, in trying to develop a network, that's constant is understated. And that builds trust, though. As you develop this ecosystem, as you collect the stakeholders, you must build trust. And that means telling the other stakeholders why you want to do something and then getting feedback. So this is a true interaction and collaborative. The other is very important. You need a backbone business to run it. We run an organization called Orion with a bunch of cancer centers that have agreed to share data. But if you had, every one of them had to build their own infrastructure to do it, none of it would happen. So you need a company that will lay the foundation for the stakeholders to perform. So backbone. And so those are the, if you will, the 5 key elements. And what you're going to hear from this panel, then, is the perspective on those 5 elements from those that are participating. And this is considerable, but Michael, why don't you give the perspective from the payer and the provider?
Yeah, thank you. And it's great to be here with all of you today. And I come from a payer, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, where I serve as Chief Medical Officer. I will acknowledge payers don't have the best reputation, and I think a lot of that is our own fault for not adequately communicating what we do and some of the things we do to help provide care management resources and digital apps and identify high versus low value types of care and promote the higher value care. And part of the problem is that we have this fragmented system. So you've got activities that lead to creation of value. And the system we have, which is quite fragmented, I'm not sure I'm a proponent of single payer because I believe in competition, but the system we have makes it very hard for the parties to capture the value that they create. And those differences and that incongruity makes it a challenge to do the right thing. We talked earlier about Alzheimer's, and we could be talking about something recent, Luxturna for RP65-mediated blindness. That's something where we and others covered that gene therapy, and we did one of the first outcomes-based agreements because we thought it was expensive, but worth less if it's not effective, but we wanted to make it available. But the issue here is that there's enormous cost to blindness, whether it's RP65 or others, and it's possible to demonstrate the value of that therapy financially. Yet a lot of the cost doesn't fall to a commercial payer. It falls to families, and there's career issues and some things we wrote about similar to Alzheimer's. So it makes it hard to come out with a sustainable model for paying for it. And if we don't do our jobs well, we see costs go up. And again, very misunderstood, I think, what payers do. But I view my job as really helping balance access and affordability. So in theory, if costs go up and we're not seeing what we pay being a fair value, and that's where organizations like ICER come in, and if we're not seeing cost offsets, et cetera, costs go up. Now, contrary to what some may believe, ultimately, it's not the payer paying for it. When costs go up, if there's a new blockbuster drug, we need to pay for it through taking more money in. And essentially, it's either you, the patient, paying for it, and I think we've pretty much gone as far as we can with deductibles before it looks like you don't have insurance, let's be honest. And again, cost share is at a point where they're a deterrent to getting drugs, and there have been a lot of anecdotal information about people self-regulating insulin, et cetera, which is kind of a bad idea and leads to people ending up in hospitals with high-cost care later on. So that's a problem. Which means that if we don't do our job well, you see premiums go up, and we worry about insurance affordability. I mean, there's health insurance affordability, and the concern with the weakening of the individual mandate is if younger, healthier people look at the cost and decide that they're going to forego insurance, and now there's not really a penalty, and only the sick are buying in, you end up with an unsustainable system. And it's what we in the business call a death spiral. And if you're not in the business, the word death there is a clue that it's a bad thing and not sustainable. So one of the things we're doing is trying to figure out how do you put the pieces together in a way that makes up for the degree of fragmentation. It's working with providers. So for example, oncology is a tough area. If we're saying no to something that the physician wants to do, maybe for good reason, it doesn't play well, and it raises the issue whether we should be interfering with care. And I think we have Bonnie here as Exhibit A for why, some good things can come out of experimenting and maybe being a little bit off-label. But the question is, if we're dealing with high-cost drugs, how can we thread that needle and make it a heads you win for the patient, tails you don't lose for the payer? And by payer, I mean for all of us, since we're all paying for it. And that's why we're out there approaching oncology companies about things like different types of agreements where we help promote off-label use, maybe wildly off-label, but we're asking in return, don't send us a bill if they're not effective. And let's use that as a way to drive greater access and collect real-world data. On the diagnostic side, I kind of feel bad for the diagnostics companies, because if you think about the unit of creation of value, in many cases, and particularly for personalized medicine, and there's many examples that you all know, it's a combination of the diagnostics with the pharmaceuticals, with the therapeutics. And I hear the frustration as a board member of the PMC, and it is frustrating because that value together, those pieces together would create the value, yet it's very hard for the diagnostics company to capture it because, again, back to that fragmented ecosystem, in most cases, the diagnostics company is not the same as a company making the therapeutic, and so how can we get around that? You heard about some examples, and we are trying to do more of these. You heard from Illumina yesterday what we did, and essentially, just to reiterate, it was a way for Illumina to take risk for the total cost of care for their test and others related to diagnosing certain types of abnormalities, where we expanded access to those under 35. And I won't go through all the details again, but the important point here is they took global risk. They didn't just take risk for their product, because if you think about it, I don't really care about the cost of their product. I care about the episode. I care about what it takes to get to the best outcome using the most appropriate care for people who are at risk of trisomies and other birth defects. And so it may be that in this case, and it was, the cost of their offering their lab tests went up, but that's a good thing. And we saw some offsets elsewhere. So you need some entity that's configured to take global risk. On the provider side, the providers, frankly, this is what gave me the idea 3 or 4 years ago for what we've been doing around pharmaceuticals and diagnostics. Nobody disputes that fee-for-service is a really bad system for driving toward value, paying more for doing more regardless of the outcome. And now with most of our providers in our network, and frankly most payers, the majority are in some flavor of value-based care. And it seemed like, frankly, common sense to take that and apply it to other areas. So we're doing that with diagnostics. We're actually looking at Illumina about doing something around whole genome sequencing. You've heard throughout this conference some frustration that there's a belief that this can help shorten the diagnostic odyssey, yet many payers aren't sure about the value. One way to bridge those divides are to come up with risk-sharing models that, at least for a while, free the payer from the risk of seeing increased expenses without any value, and I think even more importantly, generate real-world data. Because it is true that payers sometimes question clinical trial data, which is done in the best of all possible circumstances. Yet you find a way to produce it in the real world with all our members, not just those carefully selected, all the physicians, and it's hard to argue with what comes out of those analyses. So I think it's really important to be doing that. Now, the other thing I'll mention is that if you read the newspapers and watch some TV channels, you would think we all kind of hate each other. And it's true that there is a lot of finger pointing in this fragmented ecosystem. The problem is that PBMs, oh God, those patient advocacy groups don't care about the cost. It's the payers, providers, so there's a lot of noise out there. But what's really interesting, and this is part of why I so enjoy being out there, being part of different organizations, whether it's a PMC or others, that importantly bring together stakeholders from so many of these areas. You sit down with these people, the individuals from the companies in some cases that are getting the bad press, and you talk about the science and you talk about their commitment to the patient, and we're all doing what we're doing because we care about the patient. Again, you may see funny actions because of the economic incentives that are based on this fragmented system, but at the end of the day, you sit down with some of the pharma companies that are being questioned in the news, and at least I find the people I sit down with, I'm impressed by their focus on the science. on the benefit to their members, to their patients. And when you start to agree that that is a shared interest and kind of the center of everything, it lets you move beyond the noise and get creative and say, let's understand what your challenges are. You understand what our challenges are. How can we bridge those and do everything possible to make sure that people get the therapeutics, care, diagnostics, et cetera, they need? Because at the end of the day, this is a messy, complicated area, but it's also very simple. And I always remind the people I work with, at the end of the day, what's important is, what would you want if you were the patient or a member of your family, knowing what you know about the drug, its side effects, its benefits, et cetera? And if we know the right thing, let's find a way to make that happen.
Thank you. Right now, we're hearing a lot about real-world data, which can then be used for real-world evidence. The FDA is making a huge emphasis on this particular aspect, in part to deal with therapies that have received accelerated approval, because there needs to be some post-market analysis. To your point, is it really working for whom? So my question for payers and providers would be, how can this data system be used to generate the evidence of value? In other words, outcomes are improved.
Great question. And again, what I like about some of these types of models is that they let you, in some cases, go beyond the FDA label by removing the financial risk for the payer, and they also let you go to a broader audience, not just those physicians who are carefully selected, who do everything right, but the busy community-based physicians who may be trying to see 30 or 40 patients a day. And that's where, in many cases, health plans worry that they'll do what they're supposed to, that'll be following the playbook, that the clinical utility will emerge. So by creating an environment, and one where you're creating some, at least temporary freedom from some of the financial downside, the manufacturers and entities like Harvard Pilgrim can work together to generate that. And of course, the provider is a key part of it. So again, they have their own incentives, including getting paid more for higher cost self-administered drugs. But we are actually having
for committing to the wrong drug.
For committing to the wrong drug, but there is an incentive. They get, with a markup model, they get more for higher cost drugs. Yet, I think at the end of the day, they understand the challenges. They're trying, again, to maximize their ecosystem and to run sustainable enterprises. And we are having discussions with entities like Dana-Farber, where we're sitting back and, again, having those very high-level discussions about what does success look like, and given some of these challenges and the fact that we are sometimes on other sides of the negotiating table, how do we create that win-win with the patient in the middle that lets us get to where we're trying to, which is the appropriate access. And then the other thing, which we haven't talked a lot about, and I trust Sarah will, is there's the question of what are we paying for that therapeutic, for that outcome. And, again, that's a panel in itself. I'll just say I think it needs to be fair to all parties. It needs to be fair to the patient, to the providers, who are more and more in risk agreements, the payers, et cetera. And, we do see many companies now showing their work, which we hadn't previously. So that may be just many of the companies with the new-to-market, very high-cost therapies understand there's concern. They're in some cases going to ICER proactively and saying, let's work with you. We're committed to pricing where you say it's fair, because that will eliminate a lot of concerns on the part of payers and others. We're seeing them in some cases basically showing their work. There's a lot of other debate about how do they demonstrate the value. So I think we're getting beyond the just charge wherever you want it point. And again, that gets back to the fact that we're coming in from different silos, and it's hard to maximize for the nation. I will add that I do think that with some of the proposed legislation, I think that is more of a warning shot rather than a good solution. I worry about legislative remedies having unintended consequences. An example is the IPI, the International Price Index, which is the idea that we price it off of other countries, which superficially doesn't sound like a bad idea. Yet I found myself in a meeting last year with Seema Verma, who runs Medicare. And I said, we're in the commercial space largely, and this IPI actually is only for Medicare. Now, I know what happens with hospitals when you cut what the governments reimburse hospitals. They charge more to commercial insurers. And I said to him, I said, how are you going to prevent that from happening? And she and her staff, she looked around, they didn't have an answer. So there's all, this is complicated. There's a lot of unintended consequences. And again, I think we need to do everything possible, payers in particular, because I'd like to think we've been at the table, but a lot of our colleagues need to be. But we really need to think as a collective entity, how do we ensure that people get the care we need, or we face political decisions that may not get any of us what we want?
Thank you. Sarah, he referred to you. And part of shared value is agreed upon policy and approach. So as we gather this data, there needs to be policy in how we gather that data, security, so that, number one, patients know they're actually in the data. And so help us with what we need to do in terms of defining shared value in terms of regulation and policy of how we actually do it.
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate. And I want to bring it back to this diagram as I walk through the answer. Because one of the things that's really come through in the discussions we've had as a panel and in preparing for this and reading the case is that there's an element of courage that needs to come through all of this that we sometimes lack. And I'm talking about the fact that everyone here can look at that common agenda and think that we have one. And if you really drill down, we don't. If I'm a payer, forgive me, Michael, putting words in your mouth, I am dedicated to improving the health of my members. I am also dedicated to keeping costs down for my employer clients. Those two things happen at the same time. If I'm Anne-Marie, I have scientists busting their ass to develop the newest, greatest thing to ease patient suffering because I care about helping patients. I also have to worry about return on investment to my shareholders. I think Bonnie's the only one who gets to be like, I really just want access to the drug that my doctor says I need. I think she's it. And so what really happens here is you have to start to have, and we use this term at ICER a lot, a grown-up conversation about what that common agenda is, and can we all really move beyond those ands? Yes, I care about improving human health, and I need to keep costs down. Yes, I care about providing, if I'm a community provider, the best available care for my patients, and I need enough money to run my practice. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes those incentives are misaligned. And so bringing it back to sort of what we do at ICER and thinking about data, thinking about the other parts of the shared value system, we do think it's our mission to bring these conversations out for public debate in a setting where everyone can see the sausage getting made. And it's ugly sometimes. And it can be really tough to have these conversations because no one wants to be the one that says, gosh, that price is too high. Maybe we should think about only giving this drug to the sickest patients. That's not a great place to be in. No one wants to be at the end of the argument, well, if we lower our price, we won't have enough money to innovate, and we're just going to leave this space entirely. One of the most wonderful things about being at ICER is I get to call BS on a lot of the time. And so one of the things I think is important through the discussion today is for us all to acknowledge where do we have the common agenda and where do we not? And be open about that so that we can move beyond some of those perverse incentives and really at the end of the day deliver the grand bargain. We can get a fair price. We can demand fair access from payers. Patients get access, and manufacturers get the innovation fund they need to develop the next great thing.
Excellent, thank you. I really appreciate you emphasizing the common agenda. In fact, when you read the article in the Harvard Business Review by Mark Pfister and Mark Kramer, they say that exactly. Number one, define the problem, and everybody has to agree. And then with that, you can define metrics. Without defining the problem, you don't know what success is, and you can't measure it.
You can't have policy
So
behind it.
you're right, this is a farce if we don't start with step one, common agenda. Thank you for that. Anne-Marie, you are representing our researchers.
Thank you. So thank you to all of you for staying this late in the day. And you know, when I received the article from Bill and read it, I was on my way to Helsinki to speak at a Smart Health conference. And we've listened over the last 2 days of the great work that is happening in Finland. And I was so excited to read this article because I think it really resonates with what we are all trying to accomplish, which is to get medicines to patients and that those medicines are effective. And so the role that I have at Novartis is to understand the biology of the patients so that in collaboration with our colleagues in NIBA, we can come up with the best biomarkers to select patients and then identify those patients in our clinical studies to demonstrate efficacy of the innovative medicines that we are aiming to develop. And so it's my job not only to help to identify what those biomarkers are, but also to come up with the precision medicine solutions that will be developed alongside the medicine and that will then be launched out into the marketplace. And in order to do that, I have to work very closely with my commercial colleagues, but also it takes the broader community to help us achieve that goal. And what I love about the job that I have is it puts the patient front and center, and I think it's perfect that we started with Bonnie this afternoon. But as you will have listened, as we each have spoken, we've all said that our goal is to get medicines to patients. And so I would say that we've established at least a starting point for what our shared value is. And one of the ways that I and the team that I lead go about trying to understand the biology and develop those precision medicine solutions is to apply innovation. But we have to also think and be very mindful of whether or not different marketplaces are ready for that innovation. Because what we can adopt today in the US may not actually be, we may not be able to adopt in other countries, say in Asia, parts of Europe even, and certainly further afield. So the innovation that we can apply is really moving at a rapid pace. And in order for us to adopt that innovation, we all have to start to think about things a little differently. What has been changing in the healthcare system, and we've heard it again over the last couple of days, is this convergence of technology and science with data and digital. And we're all in different places as to how we can adopt that, how we can apply that, how we can understand it. And so the first thing we have to do is to find that common ground. By finding that common ground or the common agenda, that gives us a starting point to then start to understand and appreciate the different perspectives. In a role that really tries to understand the biology and to help to drive the science, the way we try to gain as much as we can from the ecosystem is to collaborate. And so that starts with understanding the perspective of the patient. So in a clinical trial, we might not draw those extra 20 tubes of blood. Maybe we can apply a technology that allows us to answer the same question out of 2 tubes of blood. In addition to that, we work with collaborators in academia and health systems so that we can start to really understand their perspectives, as well as to learn from them, that we can apply those learnings and hopefully come up with something even better. And I really appreciated some of the information that was shared this morning about how Novartis could do better in helping the University of Pennsylvania, because it's learning those pain points that will help us get to where we need to be. I think, though, where industry has, on the science side, has probably been able to really do the most and leverage the most is in public-private partnerships, where you bring together academia, regulatory affairs, policymakers, scientists, pharma, diagnostic companies. And there are many examples of these, but two that come to mind for me. Both were mentioned yesterday, Project Genie and BloodPack. And in both of these instances, we are looking to share data, but also to standardize those data so that they can be meaningful to the broader community. And not only so that you can all use them, but also that they can be in a regulated or regulatory level system or database. And that's what we need, because those are going to help us to come up with new insights, but also to help us start to generate the evidence that's so needed for us to start to really appreciate that shared value. I'll finish right now by saying that I think one of the biggest areas that the industry can really do their part is in education and communicating, and really helping to explain what we can do for society, but also how we can gain from society so that it is a much better area for all of us.
Thank you very much. I'm hearing a theme, one of which is on clinical trials. We had Richard's group pointed out clinical trials haven't changed in 40 years.
Exactly, and I don't think they were ever designed properly.
Very good.
Quite frankly. They weren't designed to be successful. Only something in the neighborhood of 80% of clinical trials actually, succeed. And so if you look at all the money that's
Speak a little closer to the mic.
I'm sorry, if you look at all the money that's spent on clinical trials and they haven't succeeded, that goes in line with not spending as much. I wish it was as simple as saying, you dirty rat, you're not paying for enough things, and your numbers are not correct, and there's so much that needs to be fixed. And we need to, the definition of insanity, doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different result, that's not going to work. We can't. That is not part of the solution. Change is part of the solution. Innovation, digital, everything that everybody said today, but we really need to get down and get involved at every single one of these places. 50% of the clinical trials happen in 10 states. You're asking people that are very, very sick to get on airplanes, stay in horrible hotels to participate in a clinical trial. No wonder it's only 4%. 4% is a number that is showing up consistently in the entire healthcare system. And we need to fix it.
Excellent. So in the common agenda that we were just speaking to, I think it would behoove us to have a priority or priorities, limited number, and then a design and method to address those priorities. It sounds to me like clinical trials is at the top. Again, no changes in 40 years in design. Right. Either we did it really well or we didn't, and I think we're on the latter.
Can I quickly defend clinical trials? Sorry.
Please do.
May I just quickly? So, remember that if a clinical trial fails, it's possible that's because the drug doesn't work.
But we need to learn it faster.
Sure.
We need to fail faster.
We can absolutely fail faster. I'm 100% aligned with that, but I don't want to forget that there are important scientific questions that we have to ask, and no one's come up with something better than the randomized double-blind controlled trial to do so. And so I'm ready to be part of the conversations where we have those, but there's a reason that has been the gold standard, because it tells us whether or not the effect is due to the drug or the intervention or is due to chance. I want us to fail faster and all these things. I just felt like I needed to defend clinical trials. I'm not sure if that's an unpopular opinion here, but that's
I think we all agree that we need clinical trials.
Okay.
We
Yeah.
just need to do them better.
Do them better,
and the
right.
processes need to be better.
And
access for patients
and I know
needs
that
to be way
randomized
better.
clinical trials are the mantra.
Right.
However, and this is another area that I'm really applauding the FDA, because they're coming out and saying, use real-world data as a comparator cohort. And they're beginning to predict the outcome of a randomized phase 3 trial, which takes the longest and consumes the most patients with a placebo. I mean, those are things that I think we can address through adaptive trial design and using the data that we need to create. But that data needs to be, when we design the data, we aggregate the data, we need to be thinking, what are we going to use it for? So I'm going to come back to the common agenda, and the priority is that we should be thinking of how these patients that we're following throughout their lifetime that data can be used for a more rapid analysis of whether this is an effective therapy meeting unmet need.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And again, this can be overwhelming. I mean, the risk is that you try to boil the ocean and talk too conceptually. And I think it's really helpful that we're talking about specific use cases, if you would. And one that comes to mind, and it's kind of building on what you said about clinical trials and some of the work the FDA is doing, is the fact that when you look at some of the rare diseases or ultra-rare diseases, it can be really tough to do a well-controlled classical randomized double-blind clinical trial that we all learned is the gold standard. And in cases where we've talked about this meeting where there is a second to market, it can be tough to get people enrolled. And even if it's a first to market, it can be tough to get large numbers. And some of these gene therapy pilots are costing over $1 million per individual. So when you put all that together, we're seeing drugs come to market sometimes with less data than we're used to seeing, and we're going to collect a lot of it afterwards. The problem, and again, this is back to making it work for all the parties. So that may work at the onset for the pharma company, but it may not be working for the payer, for example. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing more cases than I've ever seen before of payers looking at approved drugs, and we could be talking about Zolgensma recently, where there was a lot of noise, or back to Exondys 51 for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and some other cases, Spinraza, where you're seeing payers act very differently when these are released. And I would submit that's a bad thing because it creates confusion. And the point is, when you see drugs come to market with limited data, sometimes FDA labels that go beyond the data, payers are pushing back and they're acting very differently, meaning, by the way, it's confusing for the physicians, confusing for the patients, because depending on who their insurers, they may or may not get the drug. Frankly, it's even confusing for the companies since they can't project their revenue. So it's kind of a difficult situation, and one which is a product of our ecosystem. On the other hand, again, let's get real. Telling the companies come back when you have 5 or 10 years worth of data and 5 times as many patients because it'll be more clearly statistically significant, well, that doesn't really work if you're talking about something for unmet need where people are suffering or dying. That's not a very ethical answer. So to me, that begs for pulling the parties together, figuring out new ways to pay for these, new models. There have been proposals, none of which come to market yet, but that for some of these drugs, price them at a point where they are at the ICER benchmark, again, not to get controversial, but or something other than what the market will bear, that at least until they are, until they're vetted through collection of real-world data, have differential pricing with respect to whether it works or doesn't work, eliminate the risk for the payers, and again, employers, everyone, when we say payers, of paying a lot for things that don't pan out. And the other thing is our system isn't very good at pricing differentially based on different situations, some sort of indication-specific pricing, and there's structural reasons for that, but it's fixable. Again, going back to the recent approval of Zolgensma for spinal muscular atrophy, and again, without getting really geeky, there were different analyses of value, and it was priced at, people know, $2.1 million. Well, if you, and again, Sarah understands this better than me, but if you look at pre-symptomatic type 1 and make certain assumptions, you can come up with a value of 2.1 million. However, if you look at those who are not pre-symptomatic but showing symptoms, which is primarily where it's being used, and not just type 1, 2, 3, but just type 1, or you're looking at symptomatic and types and other types, you end up with different numbers. And depending on the assumptions, they came out with numbers from between 900,000 and 1.5 million. So, and so the point is, they're the same drug, different populations, different values. I can think of many examples of drugs coming to market that are, for sickle cell, for example, where the value in someone newborn is far more than in someone who maybe is 30 who suffered some end organ damage. Both patients should get that drug, but there's different degrees of value that are being created. We need the ability for the parties to come together and figure out new ways to pay for these so that the fear of paying excessively doesn't create a barrier to access. And also, again, that doing that lets you generate real-world data, which can then be used to make more informed decisions.
Very good. Do we have any questions in the audience? Please. Microphone, please. Microphone.
Since Anne Marie is here, she can be the messenger back to Novartis. And newborn screening, there's been a new condition that's been added to the list. It's a neurological disorder in infants, and it was very limited clinical trials. And Novartis, I'm sure, was helping FDA approve it. And there's very limited clinical utility known about this, what the outcome is, even a year or two. But Novartis set the price at $2.1 million. $2.1 million, is that correct, Anne-Marie?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay, just look at the list.
So, first of all, thank you for your question. And actually, if you were the gentleman who spoke yesterday, I'd love to get your contact information. I don't sit in the pricing part of the business, yeah. And I think, maybe I can say one point that sort of strikes me, and I think it's part of the discussion that we're having here about shared value. Yesterday, I was sitting somewhere over here, and there's a quote on the back of one of the chairs, and it says, "The secret of the care of a patient is caring for the patient." And I think at the end of the day, that is what we all aim for, is to care for the patient. And the purpose of today's discussion, and hopefully as a launch pad for future discussions, is that we all need to learn from one another, and we all need to listen to one another. And I appreciate your comment, thank you. And I would like to get your contact information. Maybe I could put you in touch with someone who could answer that better than myself. But at the end of the day, I think if we all stay focused on what we want to accomplish and have the sausage making and the difficult conversations, we will get closer to what that shared value is.
And I'd love to chime in on this if I could, Bill, if you don't mind, because it's a really interesting and important point. And I will tell you the amount of feedback that we got at ICER after we said 2.1 was a fair price for Zolgensma that told us we were full of crap was fascinating. We made a lot of people angry by saying 2.1 million was fair. It was a different group of people that get angry when we say something like the drugs for cystic fibrosis are overpriced by 70%. Different groups got angry in those two situations. Why we do the work is because we're agnostic about the price until we have a demonstrated clinical benefit that we can align with a price. And in the case of our analysis, and yes, it was small trials, and we have a lot of uncertainty about the longevity of the effect, and that's where outcomes-based payments and all of those other things can play a part, is that we're not going to get to where we need to get to curing human suffering if we only focus on the price tag and just have sticker shock. There are going to be times when $2.1 million is fair. There are going to be times when $50,000 a year is going to be grossly overpriced. And we do not have a system right now that allows us to know the difference. And that's where we sit.
Might that be another priority for this ecosystem?
Sure.
I'd agree, and I've said this, frankly, many times. If you don't have assessments like ICER that help you translate the price tag into what you get for your money, then you have people in health plans making decisions based just on the price tag. And again, we should care not about the price tag of the drug, and we're talking about drugs here, but it could be something else, but the price tag in the context of what you're getting for your money. And to Sarah's point, vastly more expensive drugs may be higher value than those are less. But in the absence of good tools like ICER, you risk people who have my job making poor decisions, and when we make poor decisions, it's the patients who suffer. So I think we really need a lot more of what ICER is doing.
And those tools will require data.
Absolutely.
Oh, amen.
Please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Terry Booker. I am a sickle cell patient advocate. And I've heard words like fair and value. And those definitions are different to everyone. And to be honest, we live in a capitalistic society. So money has always been the main point of how we do medicine, how we do justice. I'm an attorney, and I know for a fact that those who have the money to pay for an attorney get the best attorney. And the fact is, meaning the best, sometimes that means just having an attorney in general. So for us to create an ecosystem of shared value in healthcare, and we all have different definitions of value, how does that happen? Because as a patient, you telling me that, well, that I know this is the outcome that we were looking for, but even if it helps me to get out the bed, that's good for me, but you say it's not worth it financially to go forward with this drug. That, I mean, the value to me is priceless. The value to you is like, we're not spending that much money.
Thank you. I hope you read this paper, because that's exactly what they were trying to address in the paper. Companies historically have been what's in it for the company. But there is this paper, I think, justifiably explains that that's not enough. We have to design a system that creates societal benefit. And I believe that's what I'm hearing. And I also heard Bonnie talk about inclusivity and accessibility. Right. We were speaking in terms of trials, but it's care. Right. Inclusivity and accessibility for care.
So how does that happen, though, when where we are? That's my question, is how does that happen?
I would add to that, you know, the definition of personalized medicine, I read this the other day, getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time. And I think one thing that could help you and what you do and what everybody does, we're entering the world of genomic profiling. It's genomics. It's going to be really a game changer, is already a game changer. One thing we could do for patients that are being given chemotherapy first line, when they have an EGFR mutation, and they really should be on osimertinib, there should be some type of responsibility back to the attending physician to say, we can't pay for that.
Right. We need a tool that uses the data that can be presented to the point of care to the physician.
So it's not just about paying, it's paying the right amount for the right drug at the right time. And, you know, for everybody here, the value for a patient is life.
Absolutely.
And if we start every conversation with how can we give the patient the best life possible and save the most money possible, and, do it right and do it better.
So the metric I would again submit is that we have to improve inclusivity, which can be measured, as well as accessibility.
Yeah. I'd also add, and thank you for your comments, I think they're very reasonable. And I think part of the reason we're in this situation is we measure what we can measure, which frequently are things that are claims driven. We can measure who's been in the hospital, who went to the doctor less, et cetera, which may or may not be what's important to you. But more and more, and I find this when I'm sitting down with companies trying to do innovative value-based agreements, we start by asking not just what are the obvious objective measures, but what is important to the patients. And, and we may check with advocacy groups, although I'm finding that a lot of the pharma companies that are involved in these rare diseases, that they actually are closer to it than we are, and we just have to listen. The other thing I will say is we're trying to build it into how we function every day. So I'll give you a very practical example. Our P&T committee, which determines what drugs we cover under the pharmacy benefit and with what cost shares, and I chair it, so I'm at the table. We were reviewing last year a category of diabetic drug, which had self-injector type of devices. We passed them around the room, and one of the pharmacists whose job it had been to do the research said, we spoke to patients, and by and large, they prefer this one. They find it easier to use and more comfortable. And even though that wasn't the cheapest, that's the one we preferred. So we're trying to take baby steps to do the right thing, just like you're asking for.
Bill, just very quickly on that, because this is really important, and I really appreciate the question. I think that it's also important to remember, I do a lot of work with patient advocacy groups, and the number one thing I hear from them is how disappointed they are that the outcomes that they care about are nowhere in the clinical trial data. Nowhere. And ICER has taken it as one of our responsibilities to amplify that voice when we do a report. And our policy recommendations that come out of our work at the end often have, in bold letters, do better. This is what we heard from all of the patients that we talked about, what actually matters, and we couldn't find data on that anywhere. And I would also add that what that means is we kind of go to war with the data we have when we launch, and we might come up with a price that reflects the data that was collected and might be lower than the actual full value of the asset once we know everything it can do and all of the patient-centered outcomes it can address. And that doesn't mean we don't get access to it. It means the price is lower. And that way you still get out of bed in the morning feeling great because you're able to get access to that drug.
We need to give the patients a voice, but we have to give them a forum for that voice. And I think that's
We're working a
what's
lot
right.
on that, Bill. I think that's well said.
Can I add because I think inclusivity is a very important point that's been raised, and I'd like to tie it back a little bit to what Bonnie's already said with that 10 centers in the US conduct more than 50% of all the clinical trials. There was a report that came out very recently to do with machine learning and generating algorithms to define certain patient populations for treatment. However, these data were mostly derived from Caucasians, which really doesn't help a lot of people. And so that's another component within our clinical studies. It's not just the limited number of centers, but it's also the populations that are being recruited to those studies. And I think that's another area for inclusivity that we need to really think carefully about moving forward.
Which means you have to have more than 10 states involved in collecting that data.
And global, of course, as well.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yep.
Hannah Mamushka from Alvaten. Bonnie's point is straight on, and I want to bring it out a little bit broader because the thing is patients obviously don't want to go on drugs that aren't going to benefit them, especially if they have a serious or progressive disease. I'm not going to pick on Zolgensma, I'll pick on Spinraza. Sorry if anyone from Biogen's in the audience. But if you use that as an example of a drug with a $750,000 price tag, a 40% response rate, and incredibly eloquently published biology on exactly how the drug works, yet no companion stratifying diagnostic tool to identify those responders. And you think about the benefit that a diagnostic would bring in that space, and then you start thinking about some of the other big disease areas, autoimmune diseases, some of the big drug classes where you see an average of 30 to 40% response rate, no stratifying diagnostic tools, and a very difficult space for diagnostics to break into the market. I know Michael's heard my spiel on this a lot, but how do we create a market that incentivizes diagnostic developers to be able to develop these tools to the benefit of patients who really only want to go on therapies that are going to work for them, to to the benefit of payers and our general health ecosystem, because we are wasting an enormous amount of money right now on ineffective therapies, because despite the fact that every drug that's been developed in the past 30 years is a rationally designed targeted therapy, we really only have these diagnostic tools in oncology, and not even in all of oncology. So how do we create that ecosystem within this shared value metric that incentivizes and encourages that development?
Excellent question. I think in part it's what we're tend to do is a marker for a drug. That's not the way it works. It's a system, and we're dealing with a system. So there may be a positive marker, but the system doesn't reflect it. So the complexity is quite, but Pam?
No, I would just say quickly, it's the financial incentives. The financial incentives aren't there because AbbVie still gets to, give a huge rebate on Humira, and everyone has to step through Humira before they can get any other drug. Doesn't matter whether they're like, okay, so 40% will fail, and then they'll move on to another one because the financial incentive is such that that's what people focus on. So until we change the financial incentives, the ability to have different prices for different populations, for different indications. I mean, I remember talking to Harvard Pilgrim about this years ago, and how sad it was when they realized their own, and this was years ago, Michael, I'm sorry, it's probably better now, that their own claims adjudication system didn't allow them to have like 2 different codes in order to pay for 2 different types of prostate cancer treatment. It was like literally did not exist. They wanted to pay higher for this one and lower for that one in different settings, and so we have to change the financial incentives.
But I think another part not to be ignored, and Hannah, you know this as well as I'm about to say, that the technology hasn't been available to really help to tease out those populations in diseases outside of oncology until recently. And I think we're now seeing that. Yesterday, we had SomaLogic was represented, but there are other technologies like that which can be used in diseases outside of oncology, as well as in oncology. And we can start to now look at not just the genome, but the proteome, the epigenome, the immunome, and all the other omes that we might need to look at. And it's going to be the combination of those data along with the outcomes data. And ultimately, it'll be an algorithm that becomes the diagnostic for selecting those patients. But we're just starting to get there.
I want to thank the panel. Did you?
No, I would say I take your point on that, and I do agree, but I worked on a drug 20 years ago and developed a diagnostic for that drug 20 years ago. And the FDA approved the drug without the diagnostic. And that was ELISA-based technology that could be applied to that drug today, and of course is not. So I do think in some complex diseases we're just getting there, but I think we could be doing a lot better. I think the diagnostic industry is ready to step up.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel and the audience.
Thank you.
It's a good day when I've learned something, and I've learned quite a bit, so thank you very much.
Yeah. Without prejudice to the discussions that came before this, in my opinion, I think we saved the best till last.
Call Mike and tell him.
And I also want to note that we're going to reconvene here November 18th and 19th, and we'll continue by trying to solve the problems that personalized medicine and patients face, which is our mission. And I want to thank everybody for coming here and helping us do that. And I finally especially want to thank my colleagues at the Personalized Medicine Coalition for organizing this conference. And I would like to offer a round of applause to all of them. So I hope I can say we'll see you next year, especially to the group in the audience now.